In order to survive, the organisms on this planet have developed a variety of relationships. Some of these relationships are complex, others are simple. Some are one-sided, while others are mutually beneficial. Whatever the relationship, all organisms interact with other organisms and non-living factors, forming an intricate web of life.
What does the word relationship mean to you? In this program, we'll look at relationships among individuals of the same species, as well as among members of different species. You will learn about interspecific and intraspecific competition. You will see a predator-prey simulation in action and explore symbiotic relationships. By the end of the program, you will understand how certain relationships influence population changes and the important role that every organism plays in maintaining life on the planet.
Three weeks ago, we were asked to plan an experiment that demonstrates competition between organisms.
We decided to use two plant species, beans and peas. We wanted to investigate the effect of competition on plant growth.
Our hypothesis was that when plants compete for resources such as minerals and water, those that grow in less crowded conditions will be healthier than those plants that grow in crowded conditions.
In this experiment, we are examining both types of competition, interspecific competition and interspecific competition. Bean plants competing with each other is intraspecific competition, when members of the same species compete for resources. Bean and pea plants competing with each other is interspecific competition.
How do you remember the difference between intraspecific competition and interspecific competition?
Well, I have a little trick. What I do is I compare competition in nature to team sports in school.
What do you mean?
Well, think about intraspecific competition as intramurals. Intramural competitions between students in one school. So intraspecific competition is competition between members of the same species.
Okay, I get it. But what about interspecific competition?
Well, interspecific competition is like intervarsity competition between two different schools.
So interspecific competition is competition between two different species.
Yeah, you got it.
So how did you set up this experiment?
Well, in pot A we planted one pea seed, and in pot B we planted one bean seed. So pots A and B together make up our control group. Now pots C, D, and E contain 5, 10, and 20 pea seeds respectively, and pots F, G, and H contain 5, 10, and 20 bean seeds respectively. Now pot I contains 10 bean seeds and 10 pea seeds together. So pots C to I form our experimental group.
What's the purpose in having a control group and an experimental group?
Control group is the standard which we compare the others. In this case, we want to compare the growth of plants where there was no competition, control plots A and B, to the growth of plants where there was competition, the experimental group.
We should also mention the variables in this experiment. The manipulated variable was the amount of seeds we put into each pot, and the fixed or controlled variables were the amount of soil in each pot, 300 grams, the amount of water each pot received, which was 100 milliliters every 2 days, the duration and intensity of light, and a constant temperature of 20 degrees Celsius. These variables were the same for all the pots.
The responding variables in this experiment are plant height and number of leaves. These factors may vary according to density or number of plants in the pot. Another variable we could have measured is the mass of the plant.
We recorded data for the entire 3 weeks. Every 4 days we would measure the plant's height and record the number of leaves on each plant. We would then write that data down in our lab books.
Today is the last day of our experiment. We're going to collect our final data and analyze it to see if it confirms our hypothesis or if we must reject it.
While they do that, let's take another look at this experimental design. In their experiment, Benez and Cameron used a control group. This group was used as a standard of comparison. Competition was not a factor in the control group. The experimental group was the group in which competition was a factor. In a scientific experiment, there are three types of variables. Manipulated variables, which are the variables that the experimenter deliberately changes, in this case, the number of plants per pot. Fixed or controlled variables are the variables that are kept constant, the space, soil, water, light, and temperature. Responding variables are the measurable responses to the change in the manipulated variables, in this case, the height and number of leaves.
So how's your experiment going?
Oh, just graphing the data from the experiment now.
Oh, let me see. Oh, this is very interesting data. So what interpretations can you make from this data?
Well, the plants that were in the control group when there was no competition was the tallest. Then, the competition for resources increased, the plant growth decreased.
Oh, very interesting. Anything else?
Yeah, it was the same for number of leaves. The plant in the control group had the highest number of leaves, but as the population per pot increased, the number of leaves per plant decreased.
Oh, so what conclusions can you make from this data now?
Well, competition limits the growth of a population.
In intraspecific competition, the greater the number of plants competing for common resources in a given space, the more their growth will be affected. In the case of interspecific competition, those species that have adaptations that increase their efficiency at using common resources may have a survival advantage over other species. In this experiment, the individual pea and bean plants in the control group were taller and had more leaves because they were not in direct competition with each other or with members of their own species.
But if species compete with one another for the same resources, wouldn't one species eventually eliminate the other?
Well, actually, in nature, that can happen. If one species has adaptations that makes it more efficient at using a common resource, it can eliminate competing species. This is called the principle of competitive exclusion, or Gauss's principle. It is named after an ecologist, G.F. Gauss. He demonstrated this principle in his laboratory. Let's take a look at some graphs from Gauss's experiment with two species of Paramecia, Paramecium aurelia and Paramecium caudatum.
Paramecium caudatum and Paramecium aurelia were grown in separate laboratory cultures with a constant food supply. Both populations grew to their carrying capacity, that is, the greatest number of organisms that the space and nutrients could sustain. When the two species were grown together, Paramecium aurelia was more efficient in obtaining food, and Paramecium caudatum was driven to extinction.
I read in my textbook that competitive exclusion does not seem to occur too often in nature. Instead, there's something called resource partitioning.
That's right, Vanessa. In nature, organisms often do resource partitioning. This means that species that live close together partition their resources so that their niche is slightly different.
Niche means lifestyle of an organism, right?
Right. Or in other words, it's the total interaction of an organism with its biotic and abiotic factors.
So, an example of resource partitioning would be the hawk and the owl.
Yeah, the hawk hunts during the day and the owl at night. So even though they share the same habitat, their niche is slightly different, therefore decreasing the competition for common food sources.
Right. Now, let's have a look at another example of resource partitioning.
5 species of North American warblers all feed on insects living on the same tree, but they feed in different sections of the tree, thereby decreasing interspecific competition. There are 2 theories to explain resource partitioning. One states that individuals with similar characteristics are selected against. This leads to a divergence of traits among members of that species. The other theory states that different characteristics evolve among individuals of a species that are geographically isolated.
Okay, that's resource partitioning, but what about competitive exclusion? Does it ever happen in nature?
Yes, sometimes it happens, and that can be devastating to the ecosystem because it reduces biodiversity. An example of that is purple loosestrife.
Purple
Loosestrife. It's a plant that was brought from Europe in the early 1800s. Now, I want you to get your rubber boots because we are going to the river to meet some purple loosestrife.
Purple loosestrife is a noxious weed, and what it does is it creates a monoculture stand, and it displaces a lot of the native vegetation that you see here today. What happens is it outcompetes a lot of the native plant material, and pretty soon the only thing you'll see growing here is purple loosestrife.
Do all foreign species, such as the purple loosestrife, have an effect on all native species?
Yes, they do. That's the problem. And the problem with a lot of the non-native plant species are they're so aggressive that they outcompete a lot of the native vegetation. And in this instance, with purple loosestrife, what happens is the natural wildlife that live in this area here, they consume the vegetation, their normal food source, and purple loosestrife is so aggressive that it moves in behind and takes over the bare areas where the plants have been consumed. Plus, each plant produces about 2.5 million seeds. And so the plant reproduces by seed. It'll reproduce vegetatively. What that means, any portion of the leaf or the stem will root usually within 2 days to start a new plant. So it's quite aggressive.
There are lots of examples of interspecific and intraspecific competition out here in nature. Let's see how many examples we can document. Save your photos for mounting in your journals. Those of you at home can find examples in your own backyards.
That looks like an example of interspecific competition.
Yeah, Cam. Why don't you go in between the two populations of flowers? Yeah.
Why did you call that interspecific competition?
Because those are two flower species, and they compete for the same resources, space, minerals, and water.
Okay.
What exactly are those ducks eating?
I think they're eating aquatic insects.
But the insects aren't competing for a resource. They are a resource. They're lunch.
That's right. The interaction between the ducks and the insects is another type of interaction. Any guesses?
Fast food?
It's called predation.
And the insect is called prey?
That's right. The insect is the prey. Predation is an interaction in which one organism hunts and kills another organism. The hunter is called the predator, and the organism that is hunted is the prey. Okay, we are going to do a predator-prey simulation. I want to see if you predators have what it takes. Here are the helpless victims. You predators need to eat at least 4 prey in order to survive into the next trial and produce offspring. But before we do that, we're going to be given some qualities that will make you less fit. Keep the wrappers for proof and give them to me. There are 20 of each color, and I'll add 1 new prey for every 2 that survive. I will also add 1 new predator for every 2 that survive. Okay, let's see who will be the most successful. How did it go?
Well, those predators that weren't so fit didn't last very long.
Oh, interesting. Now, how did the large number of prey affect the predator population?
Well, when the prey was abundant, we were able to capture enough prey to survive into the next generation and produce offspring.
That would mean that there were lots of predators. How would a large number of predators affect the prey population?
Well, some of the prey decreased, especially the silver ones.
And how would the decrease in prey affect the predator population?
Well, the predator couldn't find enough prey to survive, so many died, and less offspring were produced.
Excellent! When we get back to the classroom, we're going to look at some graphs on predator and prey relationships. Now, this is interesting. Not all the colors were eaten equally. Some of you were not keen on the red ones. Why not?
Because the red ones tasted disgusting.
Oh, I think this one is delicious. Here, try it.
Oh, no way.
The reason why there were different colored chocolates was to show some of the adaptations that some species have evolved to avoid being eaten. Were you able to capture as many greens as silvers?
No, we couldn't see the green ones as easily as the silver.
Must have been camouflaged.
Yeah, they just blended right in.
Exactly. Some species, like the emerald tree boa and the bell's horn frog, have evolved color patterns that match their environment. This makes them harder for predators to find. This is called cryptic coloration.
Well, what about the red eggs? They were easy to see, but they tasted so horrible we didn't want to eat them. What kind of adaptation is that?
Well, that is called warning coloration. In some cases, color is used as a warning to stay away.
So, bright-colored organisms taste bad. Then bright color serves as a warning to predators?
The South American blue-bellied arrow frog is brightly colored to warn predators of its poisonous nature. The mangrove snake is also poisonous. Its bright color advertises that fact.
So, in our simulation, the red chocolates represented warning coloration.
Exactly. So, who wants a pretty red one?
Okay.
Well, I had a red one, and it tasted pretty okay to me.
Did you have a one-stripe red or a two-stripe red?
Well, I'm not too sure.
That is because not all bright color organisms are distasteful to the palate. Some of them just mimic the real thing. The true poisonous organisms are called models. When other organisms copy their color pattern, that is called mimicry. So predators now avoid both the poisonous organism and the mimic. Mimicry is provided by the coral snake and the Honduran milk snake. The coral snake is the model, and the Honduran milk snake is the mimic.
Since plants are eaten by other organisms, they're considered prey, right?
Right.
Well, what kind of defensive adaptations do plants have?
Let's check it out.
Plants have evolved adaptations that discourage herbivores from eating them. Some of the adaptations are thorns, hooks, or spines on their leaves, while other plants produce chemicals that make them distasteful or lethal.
Let's take another look at how predators and prey are interdependent and how their populations fluctuate over time. This graph was made by counting all the pelts of the lynx and the hare purchased by the Hudson Bay Company between 1845 and 1935. What does it show?
Well, it looks like the hares increased in numbers first. They're the prey. Then the lynx, the predators, increased. More predators would eat more prey, which would then reduce the population of hares, causing the lynx population to drop off, since less hare means less food. Talk about vicious cycles. Basically, if the predators don't eat all the prey, the two populations follow each other in cycles. Now, let's look at what can happen to a population of prey when predators are absent. This graph shows the population growth of a reindeer herd where there were no predators. In 1911, 25 reindeer were introduced onto one of the Pribilof Islands in the Bering Sea off the coast of Alaska. The reindeer had no predators. The herd grew exponentially until it reached 2,000 reindeer in 1938. At this point, the small island was seriously overgrazed, and the population declined rapidly. By 1950, only 8 reindeer survived. If there were predators, the reindeer population might not have reached such high numbers, and the island might not have been overgrazed.
An interesting observation is that some prey populations will exhibit the same population cycles as the hare, even in the absence of predators.
What's the main predator of elk in this region?
In this area, in the Lower Bow Valley, wolves are probably the primary predator on elk.
Would it be to the elk population's advantage to remove their predators?
In the absence of predation, there is quite a noticeable effect on the food supply and on the vegetation in the area. Here in the Lower Bow Valley, we don't have any aspen tree regeneration at all, and we suspect that's because of the large number of elk, and they're eating most of the young aspen saplings as they grow.
How does human intervention affect predator-prey interaction?
The Trans-Canada originally was responsible for a lot of wildlife deaths. Something as simple as a highway has has caused that kind of change, I suppose, in predator relations and from human intervention. And the considerable reluctance of the large wary carnivores, again wolves are the best example, but grizzly bears and cougars also fit into the picture, where they're completely reluctant to use these areas where there's a constriction or a pinch point. And so these developments, in combination with one another, seem to be restricting movements up and down the valley and from the valley tops to the valley sides to the valley bottom.
Symbiosis is a relationship in which two organisms of different species live in close association, and at least one of the organisms benefits from this association. There are 3 types of symbiotic relationships. Can I have a look at your book? This one right here, it's an example of a symbiotic relationship. Any guesses?
I would say parasitism.
You're right. Can you explain it?
Parasitism is a symbiotic relationship where the parasite benefits at the expense of the host by using some of its energy, but it usually doesn't kill it. It's different from predation in that the parasite actually lives with a larger host organism.
Excellent. It sounds like you're ready for your interview with Dr. Lipitsky.
The giant liver fluke is a parasite that lives off the elk.
The flukes, they live right inside the liver, and they live in these large cavities called cysts.
Do the flukes kill the elk?
In certain cases, yes, the flukes can kill the elk. It can predispose certain animals. Some animals may be more prone to predation than other animals. Say if you're being pursued by a wolf and you're infected, say you only have 30% of a normal liver tissue left, being infected, that may give the wolf just a little bit of an edge that he will be able to catch you.
How do fluke transmit from one elk to another?
This is a parasite has a very complicated life cycle. In fact, most parasites have complicated life cycles. And in this particular life cycle, the adults are found in the liver. The parasites, they lay eggs in the liver. The eggs exit through the animal, through the feces, through the pellets. They land in vegetation or in water. If they land in water and under the proper environmental conditions, the eggs hatch into little larvae called parasidium. They have cilia. They swim in the water. And what they do is they penetrate snails. And there are several rounds of asexual reproduction of parasite in the snail, and then another larva is released from the snail, and that's called a cercaria. It has a tail, so again it swims through the water and attaches to vegetation. And then the elk comes along, and as it's browsing, as it's grazing in the sedge marshes, it accidentally eats this metacercaria, and then the whole life cycle starts up again. This liver doesn't look too bad, but there should be something in this large cyst over here. What I'll do is maybe cut it in half. Here we have a fluke.
How common are flukes in the elk population?
Over 90% of the elk in Banff are infected with the giant liver fluke. Oh, that's a nice one.
Okay, if parasitism is one form of symbiosis, what are the other 2?
Well, what about butterflies and flowers? The butterflies feed on flowers and at the same time pollinate them. Is that an example?
Yes, you just described mutualism.
That's where both organisms benefit. Take lichen, for example. It consists of 2 organisms from different species. The fungus provides protection and absorbs water, while the algae manufactures carbohydrates on which the fungus feeds. Humans also form mutualistic relationships with other species. For example, the mutualistic relationship with E. coli, a strain of bacteria that inhabits the intestines. The bacteria obtain nutrients from the digestive tract and keep the disease-causing bacteria out.
The third symbiotic relationship is called commensalism. Any ideas?
Is that where one organism benefits and the other's not affected?
Exactly. An example of commensalism is the relationship between epiphytes and trees. epiphytes are plants that grow trees without damaging them. The epiphytes benefit by living high in the air where they can get more sunlight than if they grew on the forest floor. Here's one for you. If the beneficiary of parasitism is called a parasite, what would we call the beneficiary of commensalism?
The commensal.
Right. Now, let's summarize what we have learned in this program.
In the short term, competition affects both species negatively, but when considered over a longer period of time, both species benefit. Competition ensures that those species having adaptations more suited for their survival will be selected. These traits will then be passed on to future generations.
Predation is positive for the predator and negative for the prey.
Parasitism is similar to predation. The parasite benefits while the host is harmed. But in predation, the predator kills the prey, while in parasitism, the parasite usually does not kill the host.
And in mutualism, both species are positively affected.
Also, as you can see on the chart, commensalism positively affects the commensal, while other organism is not affected.
See, you made a really nice chart there. Oh, and you have very interesting information on parasites.
No kidding. Do you know how many parasites can live in humans? Bacteria, protozoan, viruses.
Worms, sometimes 30 centimeters long and 4 centimeters thick.
They can even block intestines.
Do these parasites, are they found in North America as well?
Yes, there's actually quite a few parasites that can affect people in North America. Giardia, the one that causes beaver fever, it's a common one.
Yeah, but parasites don't affect North American populations to the extent that they affect populations in the developing countries.
Why would that be?
Probably due to poor living conditions. In some developing countries, the water supply is often contaminated by parasites due to a lack of effective waste management.
If the water supply was contaminated, that would mean that the people would be reinfected several times in their lives.
How would parasites affect the population as a whole?
If the infestation rate was very high, it could lead to high infant mortality.
But parasites usually don't kill off their hosts.
Well, if the parasite robbed its host of nutrients, the host would be more susceptible to other parasitic infections which could kill it.
So obviously the population wouldn't be able to grow to its full potential.
Good analysis. Parasites lead to illness, which will weaken the working population and decrease productivity. Decreased productivity is one of the factors that lead to poverty. And poverty encourages illness. As you said before, talk about vicious cycles. Next time you hear someone talk about a relationship, you will know that it means more than just human interaction. You will think about the many relationships in biology, from competitors to commensals, parasites, predators, and prey. All the organisms on Earth are somehow connected, and all play an important role in maintaining the balance of life on the planet.